Well, welcome everyone. We're excited today to talk about the 2022 BANFF Kidney Meeting Report. I'm Carrie Schinstock. I'm a nephrologist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and I'm really excited about our outstanding panelist of speakers today to talk about this meeting report. We have Michael Mengel from the University of Alberta in Canada. We have Maarten Naesens from Leuven, Belgium. And lastly, we have Carrie Roufosse from the Imperial College of London Department of Pathology. So we have some great things to talk about today, and excited to hear Michael Mengel start us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. I have a hole in my window. Okay, I got it. Thank you for the introduction. And I will just give a brief overview about what the BANFF process is, which is now in place as the international consensus process for allograft pathology and diagnostics of rejection in the various types of organ transplants for over 30 years. It started in 1991 for the kidney classification and is since proceeding in all organ systems. Here are my disclosures, and I have nothing relevant to disclose for this brief presentation. This outlines the BANFF process. On the bottom left, you see here the BANFF Center of Fine Arts, and this is actually the original building where the very first BANFF meeting was held in 1991, and these mountains are real in Canada and the Rockies. And here on the right, you see the organizational structure of the BANFF Foundation for Allograft Pathology, which is a non-for-profit organization as the custodianship for the BANFF process, organizing the BANFF meetings and supporting the knowledge translation and knowledge distribution of the BANFF classification. And since its inception in 1991, the BANFF process as a self-governed consensus process at the international level is driven by key opinion leaders and members, or not even, there is no membership fee to a BANFF society, but everybody who wants to contribute to the field from the beginning and has been multidisciplinary between pathologists and clinicians and surgeons and scientists, meeting every 2 years and discussing the progress and the advancement of diagnostic and developments in organ transplantation, and putting that into the consensus classification based on the main pathology seen in the biopsy. BANFF classifications are centered around the biopsy and have an integrated view of ancillary diagnostic testings, but always in the context of the biopsy. And as new knowledge emerges, the community reconvenes, discusses this, and refines the classification. And there has been major evolution since 1991 with the discovery of new diagnostic entity, the adoption of new diagnostic tests based on the biopsy, and the integration of donor-specific antibody and now molecular diagnostics and decision support tools in recent times. The BANFF process over 30 years has been driven by a large group of international individuals who transiently or permanently contributed to the advancement of the classification. And in this publication, Alex Lupi did a network analysis of how the people interact and collaborate with each other in between the BANFF meetings to generate the knowledge to advance the classification and the diagnostic standard. The outcome of every classification or update and meeting and the discussions at the meetings, which are every 2 years, are published in the BANFF meeting reports. Here is the first one from the first BANFF meeting in 1991, published in 1993 in Kidney International. And various major changes, as you can see over time, have informed the classification, and the classification has had major impact on the community as it is with the biopsy-based diagnostics for the endpoints in clinical trials and the adoption of new diagnostics and new drugs built on the BANFF classification. However, over time, the classification evolved, became more complex, and as you can see, there is many authors involved in the BANFF meeting reports contributing to the BANFF classification, but since it is used globally, by many users for research, clinical care, and also the design of clinical trials. The communication and utilization of the classification in an appropriate manner has become complex and challenging. And to engage the end users better, this year we embarked on a new process to engage the broader transplant community widely in having input into the BANFF meeting reports, and with that into the classification, because usually it was driven by the individuals at the meeting contributing to the discussion. But this time, the meeting was held in 2022 in September in Banff, Canada. We went a step further. The leads of the Oregon groups had written the first draft of the meeting report, circulated it wider for the whole attendance of the meeting, including a survey to give feedback on certain major topics of the 2022 meeting, including a Delphi consensus process. So not just a discussion in person at the meeting, but an online Delphi process for generating consensus. And then the advanced versions of the meeting reports were published on preprint servers in May 2023, right before the ATC this year. And since then, until end of this week, June 30th, the preprint versions of the non-peer-reviewed meeting report drafts can be downloaded, and there is a comment section available, a link to the AGT BANFF blog website where you can provide feedback and input into the classification and the meeting reports. And once this is completed in June, the final versions of the meeting reports will be generated and submitted for peer review to AJT, and then hopefully published later this year. So this is how the BANFF AJT blog website looks. You can just go to the AJT, American Journal of Transplantation website, and then there is the AJT BANFF blog. You press on this and you can comment and provide feedback on the different meeting reports. And this is cross-referenced and linked to the preprint server website. And today, Dr. Maarten Naesens, Dr. Candice Roufosse will present to you the 2 kidney meeting reports in its advanced stages and the key findings and key topics discussed in these meeting reports. And then after this webinar, you still have time until the end of this week to go to the AJT BANFF blog and post your comments and provide direct feedback to the authors of the various meeting reports in real time. And with that, I'm handing it over to Maarten to talk about the kidney meeting report.
So thank you very much, Michael. I will indeed try to share my screen now. So thank you very much for the invitation to discuss with you one of these 2 BANFF 2022 papers for kidney, as indicated by Michael. So it's my task today to outline you our discussions and conclusions on microvascular inflammation, antibody-mediated rejection, and also biopsy-based transcript analysis. So I'm a clinical nephrologist, and perhaps I can start with an exemplary case of Mrs. MK. She's 57 years of age, original disease IgA nephropathy, had the first kidney transplant in 2007, which failed in 2018, and she was called for a second transplant at the end of April this year. She is highly sensitized with HLA class 1 and class 2 molecules, but we did not have any detected DSA against the donor kidney that was offered on the 29th of April, not historically, not current at the time of transplantation, and the donor kidney was perfect, of perfect quality. This is the evolution of the first 5 days post-transplantation, where you can see that the serum creatinine did not go down, only with 1 session of dialysis, and the kidney really did not function in these first 5 days because the patient was sensitized against non-donor specific antibodies. We were a bit anxious. We performed the first indication biopsy at day 5, but this did not show anything else than a minor tubular capillaritis lesion. We followed the patient again after one additional session of dialysis, and you can see that the creatinine remained stable, did not improve at all. And so we did a second biopsy at day 12 post-transplantation. This second biopsy showed glomerulitis, peritubular capillaritis, and endothelialitis without any tubulointerstitial inflammation. So we call this microvascular inflammation. G plus PTC would equal to 3, so really above the second criterion for AMR. This is the black screen of the immunofluorescence for the C4D staining, which was obviously entirely negative. And so this case would have been classified according to BANFF 2001 as no AMR. In BANFF 2001, AMR needed 3 criteria, the first one being lesions of AMR, the second one C4D deposition in the PTCs, which was not present here, and the third one DSA, which we did not have, at least not at the time of transplantation. According to BANFF 2013, this case would be classified as suspicious for AMR. Why is that? Because in 2013, it was decided that C4D is not always necessary to classify for AMR, and C4D negative AMR is recognized, leading to also the recognition of microvascular inflammation solely as a sufficient criterion for suspicious for AMR. In BANFF 2017 and still in BANFF classification 2019, this changed again because the cases of suspicious for AMR were removed from the BANFF classification in 2017. And so the case of Miss MK would currently be classified as no AMR again, because the third criterion being C4D deposition or DSA positivity was not fulfilled. So what did we do with that case? Well, it's obvious that when we have this severe microvascular inflammation, even despite the fact that C4D is negative, that we are quite anxious about the DSA status. If the DSA is positive in such a case, we would classify it as a full AMR and treat as full AMR. If the DSA is negative, we do not classify it as AMR according to BANFF 2019. What did we do clinically? We did not take any risk, because the day we do the biopsy at day 12, we do not have the results of the HLA-DSA at day 12. And so we started treatment for potential antibody-mediated rejection while waiting for the results of the DSA testing. We also started high doses of steroids. But you can see that evolution after this second biopsy was not going well. We were urgently asking the HLA lab to look for the single antigen beat testings and to give a detailed evaluation on the presence or absence of antibodies at any time point pre or post transplantation. But the HLA lab reported to us that there is really not the slightest indication of HLA donor-specific antibody positivity. So we decided to stop immediately the plasmapheresis sessions, the Rituxan, and just continue with a high dose of steroids. We call this case microvascular inflammation without C4D, without antibodies, only treated with steroids. And this is the evolution of the last month of this case. She came back earlier this morning and still has a creatinine of 1.1, so really indicating that this case is not behaving as a classic AMR case, but is behaving much differently. This is only one case, but we have many more of those, as has been indicated in a growing literature on cases of microvascular inflammation that are DSA negative. Exactly as we have observed in the case I just represented to you, many centers report that the outcome of these cases seems to be better than the DSA positive cases of AMR. We also have seen some studies that illustrate the molecular phenotype of these cases, and there is growing literature on how non-HLA antibodies could contribute to the phenotype we just described. Of course, the non-HLA antibodies are not easily detected with current means in the HLA labs. There are some beginning studies that suggest that natural killer cell missing self concepts are associated with the glomerulitis in these cases, but it's obvious that more validation studies are needed. We have studied a report where we showed that several of these cases could be perhaps related more to TCMR and also to HLA mismatches in the absence of antibodies. And there is a clear need for non-invasive biomarkers where there is some beginning, again, literature suggesting that donor-derived cell-free DNA, urinary chemokine, and some other biomarkers could detect subclinical microvascular inflammation in the absence of donor-specific antibodies. You see a growing literature on this topic, but one of the main problems is that all of these studies used different definitions of the entity microvascular inflammation DSA negative. And the different definitions used by the different studies, of course, complicate the interpretation and also the comparability between trials. And if one thing is very important for the BANFF, a very important endpoint of the BANFF meetings is that it allows the field to have standardized definitions of the histological phenotypes we detect in the kidney transplant biopsies, and was the reason to start the BANFF meetings, and also the reason to continue with the BANFF meetings to avoid the discrepancies between the different centers in the main definitions. And so at the BANFF 2022 meeting, we had a whole afternoon where we discussed solely the topic of microvascular inflammation with or without antibodies. And at the end of the afternoon, we had consensus, at least in the room, that we would not touch upon the definitions of antibody-mediated rejection, which also means that we would still see C4D positivity as a substitute for DSA. So where we actually follow the BANFF 2017-2019 classification in the updated one. But what it was consensus at the meeting is that we wanted to reintroduce these cases as the case of Miss MK of suspicious of AMR in BANFF 2013 in the new classification, where we would descriptively annotate these biopsies with microvascular inflammation, but in the absence of DSA and in the absence of CVD as such. An additional discussion at the meeting was about the cases that have DSA positivity that fulfilled some of the criteria for AMR, but below the threshold of G plus PTC, and in the absence of C4D, that these cases might be potentially explained by antibodies, and so that these cases of probable AMR should also be reintroduced in the BANFF system. As was indicated in the introduction by Michael, we did not stop at the BANFF meeting and did not just follow what was the discussion in the meeting room, but we then held a two-stage adapted Delphi questionnaire in December 2022 and January this year, where we questioned again about the willingness of the field to accept the reintroduction of these two, let's say, suspicious phenotypes, but also we surveyed about certain details that also are important in the ultimate writing of the BANFF classification paper. This is a screenshot of the BANFF 2019 paper, where you can see that for the antibody-mediated rejection definitions, this is a quite extensive table with a lot of detail, and these details, of course, matter. If we then want to reintroduce microvascular inflammation, DSA negative and C4D negative, and also probable AMR, we would need to add different definitions. The classification, as I said, is already quite complex, and this leads to mistakes, as recent literature has indicated. Adding new phenotypes like the DSA negative, C4D negative, microvascular inflammation, probable AMR would make it even more complex. And so for people who grew up with the histological changes of the BANFF classification, like many of us, this makes sense. But for people who are new to the field, it is not very intuitive to understand why C4D and MVI are both in criterion 2. It's not intuitive to understand why C4D is also sufficient for criterion 3. Many other details, for instance, also noted in the footnotes, lead to a lot of misinterpretations and errors in the classification of the cases. So Candice and we went back to the drawing table, and in close discussion with the BANFF leadership, we tried to see how we could simplify the BANFF reasoning and get rid of these three partially overlapping criteria as we know them until today, without, as I said, touching on the definitions of antibody-mediated rejection. So therefore, we build a decision tree where we start from classic clinical reasoning. So we start with having a histological description of a case, as we had earlier in the presentation. And then in the second stage, we look, do we have any causal markers that indicate us a causal diagnosis? And so to apply this to the cases that fulfill the first criterion for AMR, so having G or PTC or V or TMA, not otherwise explained, CG or PTCML, well, then you need to look at what is currently part of the second criteria of AMR, is the G plus PTC equal or greater than 2. This can be the case, so you're above or at or above the MVI threshold, or you can be below the MVI threshold. So this is the pure histological description of the case. And then in second stage, you want to know, is this now AMR, yes or no? Is this caused by antibodies, yes or no? And so how do we do that? Is by C4D evaluation in the PTCs and DSA assessment in the HLA labs. Once you have either C4D or DSA or both, this has always been called antibody-mediated rejection, and of course stays AMR in BANFF 2022. When you are having G plus PTC below the threshold of MVI, so not reaching 2, well, again, we evaluate the causal markers C4D and DSA. This is when C4D is positive, classified as AMR in BANFF 2019 and stays AMR in BANFF 2022, so no change there. What of course changes is that when you do not have C4D and do not have DSA, these cases were classified as no AMR according to BANFF 2019, and now we describe them as microvascular inflammation, C4D negative and DSA negative. On the other hand, when you have no threshold reached of G plus PTC, but there are lesions of AMR, and there is DSA positivity in the absence of C4D, again, this was not called anything in BANFF 2019, and now these cases would be classified as probable AMR. Cases that do not have C4D or a DSA, they were never classified as AMR and also would not be classified as anything in the new system. So again, I emphasize this, that the AMR definitions are not changed in this system, but what happens is that the new categories, or if you wish, the revival of the old suspicious cases is much better defined now in this new system. I do not want to go too much into the details because you can read it in the BANFF manuscript. But what is important is that in the BANFF manuscript, we actually discuss the rationale behind reintroducing these cases of probable AMR. We are clear that the impact of the cases that have some lesions of MVI, but not reaching the thresholds, not having C4D, that the impact on outcome is unclear, but we see these cases quite often. And the question is, does antibody-targeted therapy is relevant or not? For that, of course, research is needed, and a good and clear definition of these cases hopefully will instigate such research. With regard to the MVI, descriptively annotated as MVI DSA negative, C4D negative, it is for me quite important to stress that the causes are unclear, that there is growing literature that illustrate that the causes can be much more than antibodies, as also innate allorecognition, ischemia reperfusion injury, infections, even T-cell responses could lead to the same phenotype. And so the definition of these phenotypes hopefully will steer up the research about them and also help us in the clinical care of the patients with this phenotype as I explained in the beginning with Ms. K having a good response with solely treatment with steroids. In the survey, we also questioned not only about the introduction of MVI and probable AMR, but we also questioned about several topics of importance for the definition of AMR. For instance, the CV of new onset. So arterial intramural fibrosis of new onset was deemed by the respondents of the survey as not sufficient for the diagnosis of AMR on its own. And exactly the same for acute tubular injury on its own is too non-specific to be considered as a histological feature of AMR. And so these two features are removed from the AMR criteria. But with that, we do not say that these lesions are not important. When you see these lesions in the context of AMR, they strengthen the diagnosis, but they are not diagnostic by themselves. Acute tubular injury in the context of C4D positivity is something different, and this is currently noted in the footnotes of the BANFF classification, but would be included in the main BANFF tables, where we want to stress that in the that you need to evaluate this compiling of ATI with C4D positivity. You need to see this in the context of the type of transplantation. When this is in ABO incompatible transplant, this is called accommodation. If you have this in a positive cross-match, highly sensitized case, this could be the very early aggressive AMR, but if you have this in a conventional low-risk transplant, this likely does not mean much. And so instead of putting these details in the footnotes, this would be transferred to the main BANFF table to really get rid of all the footnotes that make the interpretation and the application of the BANFF system complex. Some final, let's say, minor changes in the wording of the BANFF classification for AMR and MVI is that we refine the wording of the biopsy-based transcript analysis, where we really emphasize that this needs to be validated before use, need to be available, but also needs defined thresholds above or below you can make clinical decisions. And another aspect that is changing here is that the current biopsy-based transcript diagnostics do not seem to substitute for DSA status. And so therefore we removed again the biopsy-based transcripts from the third criterion for diagnosis of AMR. Finally, with regard to the definition of donor-specific antibodies, the ABO antibodies were in the previous BANFF reports in the footnotes, so we now have transferred that to the main text, where we indicate that ABO antibodies really classify as non-HLA donor-specific antibodies, but that for other antibodies we follow the STAR guidelines, the STAR working group, where it is very important to understand that the testing protocols for non-HLA antibodies need to be standardized and clinically validated before propagating or proposing them for routine clinical use. And the STAR guidelines that recently came out indicate that for the current non-HLA antibodies detected, the standardization is not yet there for clinical use. So finally, I showed you a lot this picture where we outline the clinical reasoning behind the BANFF classification and integration of MVI and probable AMR in the definition of AMR. This is, of course, a simple version. And Einstein once said that we should make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And so with this figure, we have a table that outlines all the details, also the details that I just discussed regarding CV and ATI and the molecular diagnostic, so that the conjunction of the figure with the table illustrate how the BANFF classification could look like after the public commenting period. So again, I would like to thank you for your invitation. I hope this presentation helps you in understanding the definitions of AMR and why we introduced microvascular inflammation in the absence of C4D and in the absence of DSA in the BANFF classification. You are welcome to comment on the BANFF blog with this QR code. You could reach it. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to Candice for the next presentation.
Have you stopped sharing, Maarten? Thank you. Okay, I hope you can see my screen and hear me. I hope someone will shout out if that's not the case. I'm really delighted to be here, and I want to pick up where Maarten has left off by giving you some more details on other aspects of the BANFF 2022 meeting other than antibody-mediated rejection and microvascular inflammation and molecular diagnosis. I want to just briefly step back to the purpose of the BANFF meetings, which have occurred every 2 years since 1991, and that Michael Mengel outlined to you. Essentially, we have a BANFF classification that needs to respond to evidence that's emerged over the years since then, and it's done so really well. So it's met every 2 years apart from 2021, delayed because of COVID. And not every meeting results in an update, but many of them do. At the same time, I want to highlight that the basic structure of the BANFF classification has changed very little since its development in the early days, in that there are two main components to this classification that we use to make diagnoses and transplant biopsies. The first is a semi-quantitative grading system that grades activity and chronicity in the biopsies based on these BANFF lesion scores. And then the second part of the diagnostic classification are these diagnostic categories, which we then use to make diagnoses in patients. This is where we're at basically in 2019. We have six diagnostic categories, which haven't changed that much since 1991. But what we do update is the exact definitions within those categories. And Maarten has already outlined to you changes to category 2. Predominantly, I'm going to be talking to you about the other aspects of the classification. And not all of them change with each meeting, of course. The meetings tend to focus on specific areas that require updating. And I just want to highlight with a figure that we created in this new BANFF report, the importance of what happens between the BANFF meetings. So you have here on top in purple the BANFF meetings themselves, where people come together to review evidence and discuss any potential changes. But a lot happens in between, and this is partly research carried out by the wider BANFF community. That includes all of you listening to this webinar. But there's also a very important role to play for the BANFF working groups, which I'll show you a list of in a minute. These are essentially subgroups within the BANFF community, which take it upon themselves to address particular areas such as T-cell mediated rejection, and they try to prioritize unanswered questions. They may carry out some research themselves, but they might also encourage and support research by other groups. And then if someone outside in the BANFF community produces research, they will review that, grade the evidence, and bring it forward for presentation at BANFF meetings to see if it should result in an update to the classification. And we wanted to emphasize and increase the role of these working groups because we think they're really vital to how the BANFF classification can improve. So I'm showing you here a list of the main working groups with the working group leaders. And you can see that a few new working groups were created at the last BANFF meeting in response to a number of important topics that were discussed at the meeting. And I just want to highlight that most BANFF working groups presented actually at BANFF 2022, but not all working groups do, because it depends, as I said, on areas where significant progress has been made since the previous meeting and where an update is needed or not. So I just want to now discuss with you some elements on the T-cell mediated rejection working group and the activity and chronicity indices working group. I'll say a few words about digital pathology and xenotransplantation, and also a few words about clinical trials and endpoints. So there were several conversations in the T-cell mediated rejection session, predominantly on chronic active T-cell mediated rejection and borderline, which are kind of the more troublesome elements of the T-cell mediated rejection definition. This concept of chronic active TCMR was first introduced in the BANFF classification in 2005, when it was realized that chronic allograft nephropathy, as it was referred to at the time, could be due to rejection, but could also be due to non-specific causes, and that one of the elements that really helped to distinguish those sort of chronic scarring cases related to rejection was the vascular changes, so arterial interval thickening with inflammation. And so that was created as a subcategory of TCMR, this sort of chronic vascular rejection. Then over the years, it became apparent that there might be a tubulo-interstitial form of chronic T-cell mediated rejection characterized by inflammation in scarred areas. And this was on the basis that this inflammation in scarred areas was associated with graft loss, evidence of under immunosuppression, and very often also previous episodes of active T-cell mediated rejection. This category was introduced, acknowledging that further validation was needed, and a number of groups have carried out research since then, confirming the poor association of IFTA, with poor outcome, also noting its very high frequency, so more than 50% of biopsies after a year post-transplantation can show this lesion, noting its strong association with other chronic lesions such as CV and CG, but also noting that it does not appear to respond clinically or histologically to anti-TCMR therapies much. And also noting that in terms of its transcriptomic signature, when you look in biopsies with inflammation in areas of scarring, they don't show the same signature as cases with active T-cell mediated rejection. They not infrequently show features of antibody-mediated rejection or a transcriptomic signature that's different and involves injury repair and mast cell transcripts. So where are we now? For the moment, pathologists will report IFTA in their reports as a lesion score, so a semi-quantitative score. And this clearly is associated with poor outcome, whatever the underlying diagnosis, so including if you have pyelonephritis or BK nephropathy. But in terms of how IFTA is used to reach diagnosis, it's only for category 4 for the moment that IFTA is used. So it can be used as one of the features in the definition of chronic active T-cell mediated rejection. And the questions that the TCMR working group brought up around this is whether this definition as it currently stands is specific enough and usable clinically, and whether it defines any categories of biopsies that would benefit from specific treatments. So one of the things that we've done in our report of the meeting is publish the important questions that each working group put forward for discussion and for further research. I won't read through this whole table, I'll just signpoint you towards it. So whichever working group you're interested in, there will be a table that summarizes either the work they've done today or the questions that they want answered going forward. So please do go have a look and see if there's anything there that you think is missing, and give us some feedback. In terms of borderline for T-cell mediated rejection, this is a lesion that has existed really since the 1990s to designate cases that have tubular interstitial inflammation that doesn't reach the threshold for T-cell mediated rejection. And this has been studied over the years, but there have been quite a number of recent studies confirming that a significant proportion of cases that are classified as borderline behave as T-cell mediated rejection, that they're often associated with an increase in HLA mismatches, so they're likely, in many cases, alloimmune in origin, and that patients who have had an episode of borderline or T-cell mediated rejection in many cases go on to have a second episode. And when they have these repeated episodes, this results in an increased risk of graft loss. In addition to all this, many clinicians will treat borderline in an indication biopsy as T-cell mediated rejection. So all of these observations lead really the TCMR working group to think about redefining borderline, so developing revised criteria. And this is going to be one of the main questions going forward, including whether some of the elements of a past classification, the CCTT classification that used to be used a while ago, whether some of these elements could be recycled and used to help us better distinguish in the borderline cases those that are alloimmune, things like edema or the activity of the infiltrate, the presence of eosinophils, things like that. So the next working group I want to mention is the Activity and Chronicity Indices Working Group. And this working group was created now at the BANFF 2022 meeting. So we've always used BANFF lesion scores that indicate activity and chronicity since 1991. But we've used them just as an individual list of BANFF lesion scores that we introduce in our reports. And also, obviously, we use these scores to reach diagnostic categories. And some of them we know are associated with poor outcomes, CG, for example, the characteristic lesion of transplant glomerulopathy, or CT and CI, which indicate interstitial fibrosis tubular atrophy. And then a couple more recent publications have highlighted that you can create indices from aggregating these scores, either empirically or on the basis of unsupervised clustering, and that you can develop essentially indices of activity and chronicity that can be linked with graft failure. So these new publications have led to some interesting questions that require further investigation, namely around whether they add value to what we're already doing, which is listing the BANFF lesion scores in our report. Do they add value clinically, for example, in indicating for activity the potential to respond to treatment, or for chronicity the potential to not respond, or the potential for graft loss? We also need to address the question as to whether we should be using these activity and chronicity indices for all diagnostic categories. So should we be giving them for things like pyelonephritis or glomerulonephritis recurrent, or should they only be confined to certain categories such as rejection? And if we're using them in TCMR and AMR, should they replace the sort of, for AMR at least, slightly dichotomous categories of active, chronic, and chronic? So these are open questions. And the Activity and Chronicity Indices Working Group also has a list of questions, which I refer you to read in the manuscript. Digital pathology had a specific session assigned to it. So a growing number of kidney transplant pathologists are using digital pathology to read their kidney transplant biopsies, and machine learning can be applied to develop algorithms for things such as segmenting glomeruli and tubules, measuring them, also looking for inflammatory cells, so detecting inflammatory cells within these microanatomical structures. Or the machine learning can also assign weakly supervised slide level classification, which would enable pathologists to triage their workflow, so prioritizing cases with rejection, for example. A major bottleneck here is access to large, very well phenotyped data sets of whole slide images for machine learning, which requires large amounts of data. And there were some discussions around the future of digital pathology, and in particular its fair and transparent use, guided by expert pathologists. I want to commend the leaders of this particular working group for really being, I'd say, really a model of how all working groups should work, in that they have very regular meetings. I think it's once every month or 6 weeks, I can't remember exactly, but regular meetings in which they bring together experts in the field. So it really fulfills that working group mission of creating a community to discuss the important questions in the field and to bring knowledge to that field, but also it's very open and transparent, and they post recordings on YouTube. They have an active Twitter account, and this really fulfills a mission of education. So both coordinating research and educating about what research is going on, and really thinking between the BANFF meetings about how to move the field forward. Another new working group that was created is xenotransplantation. This was a very exciting session that discussed the pathology of preclinical and early clinical observations in xenotransplantation. And there was also some discussion of the role that molecular diagnosis could play in diagnosis here. And essentially, this working group will focus on recommendations for reporting pathology of xenotransplantation, so that any new centers starting up with pathology in this field can be singing from the same hymn sheet, essentially, in particular in terms of grading thrombotic microangiopathy and C4D, and potentially other ancillary investigations such as electron microscopy and RNA analysis. So again, I refer you to the paper for the questions that that working group has currently put forward to be answered. And then the last element that I want to bring to your attention is Table 6, which is an updated recommendations list for best practice when carrying out clinical trials. And this includes also observational studies in kidney transplantation that involve the reading of biopsies. And this table was already published in 2017, but we felt that it's so important that it really needs to be re-emphasized. And in particular, making aware to researchers the really importance of using the most recent BANFF classification and highlighting any deviations in their studies from the current classification if they're not using it, but also wherever possible to include public access to granular study data such as BANFF, semi-quantitative lesion scores, so that when we try to review evidence from different studies, we have granular data for meta-analysis, for example, that allow us to move the field forward. The same table gives recommendations on using kidney transplant biopsy pathology as endpoints in clinical trials, and also using molecular pathology as endpoints in clinical trials. So as Maarten showed you previously, this paper is also available online now until the end of the week for your feedback, so please give it. And in terms of what else you can do, you can also obviously carry out research in particular to answer questions formulated by the working groups, and preferably using the methods that are endorsed by the BANFF community. But you can also, if you are carrying out research, draw attention to it by contacting working group leaders. And then finally, save the date for our next conference, which is in 2024 in September in Paris. So thank you very much for your attention.
I want to, congratulate all three of the speakers. These were excellent talks. I was really impressed with how you were able to make the changes very simple and understand. So thank you. I want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, make sure that you put that into the question chat. If there's any questions that we're not able to get to, I think one of the things we could do is get those questions and maybe reach out to people directly later on. One of the first questions I'm going to ask Dr. Naesens about, one of the questions was just the attendee wanted clarification about whether the classification for ABMR was actually going to change. And with that, how are you going to use public comment for these recommendations? So Maarten?
Yes, so this is of course an important question. When I tried to convey that for AMR, the survey indicated that there were two hallmarks of the current BANFF classification 2019 that are not seen by at least the BANFF attendees and by the people who responded to the survey, which is exactly the same group of people, that there was a vast majority, so 92 and 94% of those people who voted to not longer have the new onset of arterial intimal thickening as a hallmark of antibody neutralization on its own. So leading to, for instance, the diagnosis when there's nothing else to be observed as a hallmark of AMR. And the same for acute tubular injury, which is a lesion that is not that well defined in the BANFF system. Also, this was voted by the vast majority of the attendees and of the respondents to the survey to not be used in isolation as a sole hallmark of AMR. Of course, I explained to you that when you have acute tubular injury in the context of a highly sensitized, incompatible cross-match positive transplant, as for instance, Carrie, you have been publishing on quite nicely, that these cases are different than the ATI cases in the absence of C4D. So these are the two things that change in the classification of AMR. They may seem minor, but I think that, for instance, for the cross-match positive transplants, the ones that we are seeing more and more with, for instance, the use of imlifidase, yeah, that this might be quite important in the near future, that we define it very clearly and not in the footnotes of the BANFF system. But perhaps Candice or Michael, you can add to this, because it's a difficult topic.
It's a good question. Does the classification change, right? I think the question is rather, do the diagnostic criteria for AMR change? And as you described, they suddenly, in a subtle way, do. But I think also a question related to this is MVI without DSA and C4D a new version of AMR? And I think the answer to that question is no. And this is where it gets, because what we tried at the meeting, and this is really, I think that's why we do this public engagement. So what happened at the meeting is that we know that a key pathology lesion of AMR is microvascular inflammation. But we also now know that there is a significant group of patients with microvascular inflammation which are not necessarily in the strict sense, so mechanistically mediated by donor-specific antibody. And what we try to do here is to have a consensus definition of that group. And where it gets really confusing is, it is very likely that in that group, some are AMR, but some are not. We do not know yet, right? So I think I really urge, and we heard this feedback around this topic, the core definition of AMR didn't change. So the classification of core AMR didn't change. What we try to take out is a component of AMR-like cases, which we do not fully understand. Some of those are possible AMR, and some of those are not AMR, but have microvascular inflammation. And some of those are microvascular inflammation. I don't know yet what you are. So I think we have been there with the BANFF classification before, that we are in an interim state of not understanding certain pathologies. And I know that can be very confusing, whether this is now a new version of AMR or not. And therefore, the question to is the AMR classification changing for 2022 is, yes, it depends. It's not a yes or no, right? So I know everybody wants certainty, but BANFF is an evolution, right? The 2022 version and discussion in this meeting report is likely an interim state until we deciphered the microvascular inflammation heterogeneous pool. It's similar to IFTA. We know many different diseases can cause IFTA, and we know IFTA is associated with outcome. We know microvascular inflammation is associated with outcome. So I hope we can manage that as a community, right, to help us generate the data, understanding these cases, then we can improve further the diagnostic category. But I think we have to make this clear in the meeting report, right, that not people now suddenly treat and diagnose those as AMR. And I think that's the purpose of these discussions.
Yeah, and for all clarity, we have a table 4 in the manuscript that actually is called clinical interpretation of these phenotypes. And exactly as you say, the uncertainty about the cause and also the clear uncertainty about how to best treat is conveyed here. So we really understand that confusion, and the only way to solve the confusion is to do proper research.
I just wanted
Thank
to
you.
I just wanted
No,
to
go
add
on,
to
Candice.
that. I just wanted to add to that. I think it's just a really interesting discussion, and one that, you know, if someone has a great solution to this, please tell us, because, you know, the idea behind the BANFF classification has always been to be forward-looking and to push forward improvement by introducing changes maybe slightly ahead of the game, but to get more evidence. And this has created a lot of confusion, because those using it then for their clinical practice think, oh, well, I don't have molecular diagnosis, how am I going to cope with this kind of thing? So is there a solution that can at the same time leave the classification intact, but at the same time define next to it or things that need further investigation? I think that's what we're trying to do here by creating a category, you know, MVI positive, C40 negative, DSA negative, that we don't know exactly what it is. So we're defining it, we're just leaving it next to the classification in a way. But it's a tricky one. You want a classification to evolve, but you don't want it to evolve too quick, but you don't want it just to become stuck in one state where it can no longer change. So it's tricky.
No, that's great. I think it raises a awareness that we can't just ignore those cases and that there's nothing there. So I think it's great. Now, a second part of that question, though, was, so there's all this public comment. Is that actually going to change how the manuscript is going to be going forward to the classification, or how is that public comment going to be used? And maybe Candice, you're the best to answer that question.
Yeah, so it's already being used. We got some very nice feedback from people who'd read the report very carefully and noticed a few details that we had not been clear about or that we'd gotten wrong. So some of that feedback will be used to change the final manuscript. And that was one of the aims of it, because you know, when you're writing complex text, occasionally little errors get introduced, and it's really nice to have the community out there spotting them, because they're going to have to use this in their daily diagnostic life. So they, you know, they read through it carefully. So it has already changed things, I'd say.
But I want to point out the first BANFF meeting and the first 1991 classification version was the consensus amongst 12 individuals. And I think your survey engaged 170 individuals already, and we had over 200 downloads of the preprint version of the kidney report. So I think we are reaching a way broader and larger transplant community, which all had certain version of input. And I think a theme, so for this version, is really around breaking out and deciphering the uncertain categories of microvascular inflammation and IFTA. That's our current main problem in a biopsy. And it is a main problem because we see transplants lasting longer, developing different pathologies and phenotypes than they did probably 20 years ago, where all rejection was within the first 12 months and an acute picture. And I think that's just a very good example how the classification and the diagnosis of transplant pathology evolves. And there will always be some uncertainty. And I think it is most helpful, the feedback process is to identify which areas are those of highest potential for confusion and discussion, And that's where the wording can be adjusted in the meeting report to clearly strengthen the areas under evolution and construction, so to say, and development.
No, that's great. There were some other comments that were in the question answer, and I just want to highlight those before we are going to close at 11. One issue was just the number of footnotes, and thinking about how to include the footnotes so that it's easier to understand. A way to express this idea of uncertainty that was brought up earlier, and then this idea of incorporating patient engagement also into the BANFF process, because it's really ultimately about the patient. So great questions, great comments. Again, thank you to our wonderful speakers for this great set of presentations. And I'll just let everyone know this session is recorded and will be available for viewing later. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And from AST staff and the TxDx COP, I would just like to thank our panelists so much for such a great presentation. I see that there were a lot of questions. We will make sure those get to the panelists. And if needed, we can set up to answer those offline. And I just want to say thank you to all of our attendees, and just a reminder to please complete the post-webinar evaluation survey. And thank you so much. I'm going to